Hey, welcome to Just Salvos this week. We are, in fact, honoured and really happy to be able to bring our guest to you this week. We've got the CEO of Mission Australia, Toby Hall. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi guys, it's just great to be here with you.
We want to start off by saying, look, most people know Mission Australia, amazing organisation doing like everything, a finger in every pie almost. But could you tell us, just briefly, for people who don't know, what do you do and what sort of areas are you involved in?
Yep, Mission's been around for about 150 years now, so we've been in Australia for a long time. And we focus on, I guess how we put it, is giving people a hand up. So trying to give them a new direction, new future. We start with kids and their families from probably difficult backgrounds and just try and help the kids get the right start in life. And we do that through early education programs and helping mum and dad know how to be good at being mum and dad. Teenagers, we do quite a bit of work, and to be honest, our work with teenagers is usually fixing up the teenagers who've kind of gone off the rails a little bit and saying how do we get them back on the rails and get life back on track. Adults is very simple, it's around employment and housing. So that's Mission.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
In a nutshell, fantastic.
It's great, and I just love that concept of just that hand up, not that handout. And we hear that again and again from people who are really struggling.
Yep.
That don't want a handout anymore.
Absolutely, it's interesting. In England, they did some studies, and they actually went out and spoke to drug addicts and said, "What do you want? Do you want a methadone program? Do you want something that's going to sustain you where you are?" And they actually came back and said, "The last thing we want is that. We actually want to get out of this situation. We want a different future. We want employment. We want housing." And I think we find that with most people is that actually they do want a different future. They just don't know how to get there.
Yep. And you know, for us, sorry to go off topic already, but it really is that difference between giving people justice and opportunity, access out of the current situation that they are in, as opposed to just that constant charity model.
Yep, absolutely. And I think for us, we've tried to change all of our work now to be about that. So when you look at Mission, and people question us about this now and again because we used to do all the charity stuff, and now we're about change. So it's not about giving someone shelter for a night now, it's actually a house for life. Yeah. It's not about saying, can we give you some money to sustain you today? It's about how do we get you employment and how do we deal with the challenges of why you became unemployed. And we're really trying to say, hey, let's create a different future, which is actually harder work to do. In fact, it was much easier before, and a lot of the staff will say, it was easier before doing the old stuff because you now have to really journey with people, you have to know them and relate to them, and you live the pain of life often with people, and you understand the struggles. But the other side is when it changes, it is outstanding.
Yeah. And they've changed probably their children's lives and their children's children, and the cycle ends.
Yeah, and I mean, like someone getting into employment who's been out of work, the kids see dad or mum in work, which is really good. Dad or mum's self-esteem just raises like anything. And you get letters from people who've taken their kids on their first ever family holiday. And it's just amazing. They said, I didn't know what a job would do for me. And it changes the community. It does create a different outlook.
Yeah. Look, we've got Anti-Poverty Weeks coming up in October. So we want to sort of talk a little bit about poverty, which means we'll probably be talking about homelessness and everything else that goes with it. But can you tell us first up, what does poverty look like, especially somewhere like in Australia? What do we mean by poverty?
Look, it's a really good question, and I think most Australians don't have a clue about poverty. And part of the reason why is poverty is really isolated in Australia in a lot of cases. In fact, 14 postcodes represent most poverty in Australia. And in fact, most of us never go to those postcodes. And so you've got places like Broadmeadows, like West Heidelberg in Melbourne, but in Sydney you've got Macquarie Fields. You've got Inala up in Queensland, Elizabeth in South Australia, Perth's got its own communities. And they're places we don't often go. But what happened, and actually this was government policy, and this is where justice really kicks in. People said, well, we'll create housing for parts of the community who are on lower income. We'll give them housing, and employment will come around that housing, and it will create opportunity and create jobs. And Western Sydney is a brilliant example of this. All these housing developments, which at the time I'm sure people thought were state of the art. They're a little bit ugly, really, I think. But they thought they were state of the art. But employers were going to go nearby. People were going to get trained up. But the employers never went, and the infrastructure never went, and the schools have always been substandard because people didn't want to go and teach in those communities. And when you go there today, what was maybe state of the art in the early 70s, late 60s, is now a crumpled, distraught community, both in terms of how it looks, but in the lives of people there. And when you fail to educate people, then you immediately take away their opportunity at life. And it doesn't matter whether it's in Australia or overseas. education drives where you achieve, and it's very simple to see. If a kid does not complete year 10 in Australia, chances are they're going to be unemployed at 25. Plus they're going to get involved in the justice system, they're going to get involved sometimes in drugs and alcohol, searching for something to fill the hole they've got inside. And that all starts back in the education system, and our focus at Mission is on saying we actually need to start really, really young, which is saying how do we make sure we start with our 3-year-olds, particularly in disadvantaged communities, and give them the right start in life so they actually know how to communicate with the world around them, they can learn, and they can deal with the challenges which will face them as they go into education. And how do we make sure that schools in disadvantaged communities actually, rather than receiving probably some of the weakest teachers, get the best teachers, get the strongest teachers, and start to create opportunity again.
And so that's how we can not only change the future for individuals, but entire communities can start to transform.
Absolutely, and over time I think you can create transformation in communities, and there's brilliant examples actually overseas where this has been done. Harlem, well known in America for having some real problems. When they got education right, they started to change Harlem. In England, particularly in parts of London, there's brilliant examples where they've remodelled the housing, remodelled the schools, brought in good educators, and the community transforms. And what you actually see, which is really interesting there, is one of the communities that's had all the effort put into it has transformed, and another one which might only be a mile down the road, which has had none of that, is exactly the same as I've described.
So what sort of time frame are we looking at for this transformation? I think one of the problems we seem to have in Australia is that we run election cycle to election cycle, and so our promises and our projects, often don't go beyond 3 years. What sort of time frame are we looking at to transform parts of Harlem, or in fact Broadmeadows?
I think if you take a Broadmeadows or if you take a Heidelberg, if you look at anything under 10 years, you're absolutely crazy. You've actually got to take almost the full education cycle from 3 through to 18 as a starting point. I think in a 10-year period, there's really good examples of significant change in communities, but you probably even need the longer period, sustained, continued effort to make the change. And a really good example of this actually came out of Ireland, where they had significant problems with poverty and disadvantage. And one of the brilliant things they did is they actually had a bipartisan approach to education. They said, we'll argue about everything else, which they still do, but education we are going to do together. And so the whole of the parliament made a commitment to educate their community. And what that created was absolutely brilliant outcomes for a whole range of people who in the past would have failed, in other parts of Europe have failed, in Australia have failed. Those kids actually got the education they needed, and it's done brilliantly for them.
What do you think the chances are? We've had, in 10 years, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, we've had 2 State Premiers. One of the State Premiers was the member for Broadmeadows and isn't anymore. What do you think our chances are of getting to the point where we can say as a community, we need 10 years and here's how it's going to work, no matter who's in or out?
Really, really interesting point. And we've been talking to the government ministers, and obviously we're very lucky we get to talk at quite a high level on these issues. It hasn't quite sunk in that that's what's needed yet. But what's happened actually is really interesting in that looking at the Indigenous communities, the government can do nothing other than say that in the remote communities, everything they've done, all the money, all the effort, all the time, has actually delivered very little, which is a painful thing to realise. And they've started to say to organisations like ours, how do you turn that around? I'm sure they've talked to the Salvation Army people as well. How do you create the change? And we've been able to say to them, well, look, if you want real change, if you want profound change, it takes long-term commitment. You've got to probably get a small number of organisations to deliver services rather than lots of different ones. And you've got to have people who will commit there for a long period of time. And I think for me, one of the things, particularly looking at it from a Christian attitude, I'm from a church background, is you need people who will respond to a call and say, I'll go and work and live in these communities and give my life for 10 years to create the change. And that's what's needed. And brilliantly, the government has actually listened. I've seen the first consultation paper come out and start to say, we might look at a 10-year program in a remote community. Once that happens, then you're in a brilliant position to turn around and say, how do we do that in our more disadvantaged communities in our urban areas? And they're starting to click to actually that might be the answer. So it's getting through slowly, but you're right, the political cycle is difficult and the moment is even more difficult than usual. So.
How close did we come then with something like a neighbourhood renewal program, which was a little bit more extensive and longer term and did target some of the poorer social, the poorer postcodes? How close did we come?
Look, I think neighbourhood renewal is a good thing, and I think that the heart of change in communities has to come from within the community. You've got to take what's there, take the strengths and skills which are there, and I absolutely believe that in every one of these difficult communities there are people with the gifts to change the future of those communities. So it needs to start within the community. But often it's been left to the community on their own, and they can't do it on their own. They need support from government, they need support from corporate organisations, they need support from non-profit organisations to have enough focus to help the community achieve everything they can. I liken it to, there needs to be a catalyst to get things moving, and there needs to be a commitment then to fund, to support and to help people in the community who've got the skills to do all this stuff to make it happen. And you see this time and time again, brilliant people in local communities who want to make a difference, but they work hard and they get tired because they don't get the support. But when you bring the support alongside them, brilliant models in New Zealand with this, with both white and Maori community, and some in England with this, the right support from all layers of government, from business and people in the community and non-profits can create amazing outcomes. And in the end, the community leads it. It doesn't need to be led from the outside. The community actually leads it, but they just need that helping hand. And it's the same actually for the individual. The communities need the hand up just as much as an individual does.
Yeah.
We could probably talk like this all day, but we do need to wrap up. But I'm really keen to find out about housing and housing affordability. We talked about the huge issues we have in education. Have we got the same problem in housing, and how do we overcome this? We know that we've got huge public housing waiting lists. We know we've got boarding rooms all over the place. We know who's going to build these houses, and how does this happen?
Look, housing is a major issue right across Australia. We're not building enough houses for our society, and as soon as you do that, you're going to have people who get locked out, and the people who get locked out are always the poorest and most disadvantaged. In fact, when you look at the people we lock out, people with mental health issues, it's people who have got poor families, and it's the disadvantaged because they're at the bottom of the pile economically and they get left out, and it's fundamentally wrong. Our government federally, I think, has actually set out the right response in terms of dealing with homelessness and dealing with housing. What we haven't seen is good responses in states, and to be frank, I think Victoria's response to date has been appalling. The situation where we've allowed unlicensed boarding houses, which actually are horrendous places when you go into them, is fundamentally wrong, and we need to address it. Even the licensed boarding houses aren't that nice, but it doesn't address the issue, which is people need houses. And this government and other state governments around the country need to be delivering affordable housing. We need to be very careful, and this is a really key point of justice, is that people don't want this in their backyard. So every time we try and develop affordable housing or social housing, people are saying, well, yeah, of course I want that, but I don't want it here. And we've got to stop saying that, and that's us. That's me, you, people listening on tape. When someone says we want to build affordable housing or more low density, medium housing in our area, we've got to put our hand up and say, that is what justice is about. We've got to accept it and stop the not in my backyard syndrome. Government, though, needs to put a lot of funding into this, and there's been studies done in Melbourne alone. 1 million units of housing could be put in the inner ring of the city if there were sensible planning rules and people stopped complaining about having someone who's a little bit more disadvantaged living next door to them.
How many?
There's 1 million properties.
Wow.
Which is just incredible. And you look at that and think, that would actually solve the issues of homelessness in Australia.
So why isn't it happening? I mean, you make it sound so simple. Why aren't we building these 1 million units of housing?
It's a really good question, and the heart of it, I think, is us. That we don't want that poor person or that poor family living next door to us. And of course we want them housed as long as it's somewhere else. And you know, we talk about Australia being fair, and we want to be fair as individuals, but actually we don't want that fairness to come too close to us. And it's us that's stopping it happen. And we need to challenge ourselves, but we need to go to government and say, if people aren't mature enough to deal with this crisis, then you've got to step up and do something. You've got to put your hand up, and yes, you'll get a bit of flack, but take the flack, because we shouldn't in our society have anyone homeless. There's no excuse for it.
And I think what people will begin to realise, like I live in Collingwood in Melbourne, and I just live on just off the Collingwood estate. And so here you have, you know, I don't know, 1,500 units of housing or people living in this one government housing area, and then outside of it is some of the most affluent areas. And And actually, we do all coexist, and it's not a sense of, well, that's the that's the area that we don't want to go into because it's dangerous. Actually, they're beautiful people, and life is good, in Collingwood.
Yep.
But yes, there are some things that will, every now and again your window might get smashed, and so on. That there are some things that will happen. But I think this idea of let's just lock them all in this one excluded community and throw a few social services in there and everything will be okay. Actually, it does end up worse for us because they will come out of that excluded community.
We absolutely miss out, and I think one of the major things, and particularly for Christians, is we miss out on the joy of life because in Australia we have done that. We've locked people into these communities and we don't see them, and often you see churches and communities that don't have disadvantaged people, don't have people with mental health problems. How many people come across someone who's taken drugs because we've pushed them to the margins? And in fact, we actually miss out on the richness of life. It's not just a justice issue, it's about the joy of life being missed as well because we've excluded people who actually are really brilliant people with brilliant gifts that we can actually learn to love and cherish.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's been gripping and inspiring and disheartening and inspiring again. Thank you so much for joining us, Tony. You can get more information about Mission Australia on their website, which we're showing you right now. You can also, of course, check out our website, Facebook is facebook.com/Just Salvos, or our website, www.justsalvos.com. My words aren't coming out correctly. We will see you next week.